I heard him say it clear as anything, standing right there in the hallway outside my daughter's kitchen. His voice carried the way overconfident men's voices always do. Too loud, too certain, too comfortable with the idea that nobody capable of pushing back was listening. Your father won't even notice if it's gone, Claire. He's not tracking any of it anymore. Half the time he can't even remember what day it is. I stood with my back pressed against the wall, one hand resting flat against the plaster, and I felt my heart beat the way you feel it when something you feared but refused to let yourself fully believe finally steps out of the shadows and introduces itself by name. It wasn't rage, not right away. It was something quieter than rage, and in some ways worse. It was clarity. Cold, sharp, rearranging clarity. My name is Harold James Whitmore. I am 68 years old. I spent 22 years driving executives across 3 states for Meridian Corporate Transportation, not because I couldn't do anything else, but because I understood very early that the most powerful position in any room is the one nobody notices. And I spent 11 of those years before that in the United States Army, where an old sergeant named Calvin Rourke once told me something I have never forgotten. He said, "Whitmore, the man who acts first out of anger always loses. The man who waits, plans, and acts from a place of absolute calm, that man decides how the story ends." I thought about Sergeant Rourke standing in that hallway. I thought about how right he was. His name was Derek Callum. He had married my daughter Claire 14 months earlier in a ceremony at the Harborview Gardens venue outside of Columbus, Ohio, on a Saturday in late May when the weather was so perfect it almost felt staged. I had walked Claire down the aisle. I had danced with her to a Patsy Cline song she had loved since she was 9 years old. I had shaken Derek's hand and looked him in the eye and told him sincerely that I was glad he made her happy. I had believed every word of it. Standing in that hallway, I understood that I had been a fool. Not a senile one, just a trusting one, which is different, and which I intended to correct before the sun set on another week. If you've already felt something stir in your chest just from those first few sentences, if you know what it is to love someone so much that a threat to them lands like a physical blow, then I want you to stay with me until the very end of this story. Because what happened next changed both Claire's life and mine in ways I'm still discovering. And if you're watching this on the channel and you haven't yet, please subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments whether you've ever had a moment where you heard something you were never supposed to hear. Those comments matter more than you know. Every one of them tells me that this kind of story deserves to be told out loud. Now let me go back to the beginning, because Derek Callum didn't appear in our lives already showing his true face. He never does, a man like that. He showed us the other face first, the charming one. 3 years before I stood in that hallway, my life had settled into the kind of routine that people who've lost someone describe as getting by. My wife Dorothy, Claire's mother, the woman I spent 31 years building a life with, had passed away from ovarian cancer 2.5 years prior, in the early February of what would have been our 32nd anniversary year. She went in the winter, which felt appropriate in the most painful possible way, and she left behind a house that still smelled like her lavender hand lotion every time I walked past the linen closet. I had retired from Meridian the previous spring, after a slow recognition that I was driving routes I'd memorized so completely I sometimes couldn't remember making specific turns. My body knew those roads. My mind was somewhere else. That's when you know it's time. My daily life after retirement was not exactly thrilling. I woke at 5:30, which was a habit so deeply baked into me that no alarm was necessary. I made a pot of coffee, always ground from whole beans, a habit Dorothy had started, and I'd carried on out of love and stubbornness in equal measure. I read the actual print newspaper, which I know makes me sound like a relic, but I find something steadying about the weight of folded paper in my hands. I walked my dog, a 7-year-old beagle named Corporal, who had come into our lives as a puppy when Dorothy was already sick and had never fully accepted that she was gone, still trotting to her side of the bed to check every single morning. I ate breakfast. I did light work around the yard. On Tuesdays, I volunteered at the Millbrook Veterans Resource Center, helping former servicemen and women navigate paperwork, benefits claims, housing applications, appeal letters. Bureaucracy was another thing I had learned early, the same way I'd learned roads. Learn the system, and the system loses its power over you. I spoke with Claire on the phone most evenings. She had moved to Columbus for a graphic design position with a mid-sized marketing firm about 6 years before all of this, and she was good at it. Genuinely, beautifully good in the way some people are at things that also make them happy. She had Dorothy's patience for detail and my habit of seeing the larger shape of things at once. We talked about her work, about my garden, about Corporal's ongoing refusal to accept the concept of Monday mornings. We were close in the way parents and adult children can be when both parties have made the decision to actually try. It was Claire who first mentioned Derek. This was about 3.5 years ago now. She called on a Wednesday evening. I remember because Corporal always gets his bath on Wednesdays and was sitting damp and deeply offended in the corner of the kitchen. And she mentioned him almost in passing, the way you mention something you've been thinking about for a while but have been careful not to make a big deal of. Dad, I've been seeing someone. It's still early, but I wanted you to know. His name was Derek Callum, 39 years old, an account manager for a financial consulting firm in Dublin, Ohio, a suburb on the north side of Columbus, the kind of place with newer construction and a lot of restaurants with exposed brick. He had grown up in Dayton. He played golf on weekends. He had a sister in Phoenix. He drove a dark blue Audi. I listened and I asked the questions a father asks, and I told Claire I was happy she'd found someone who made her smile because I could hear it in her voice, and I meant that fully. I wasn't suspicious. There was nothing yet to be suspicious of. I met him for the first time on a Sunday in October, 3 months after that phone call. Claire drove up to Millbrook to introduce us, and Derek came with her. He got out of that Audi in my driveway wearing a jacket that probably cost more than my first car, and he walked up and shook my hand with both of his and said, "Mr. Whitmore, Claire has told me so much about you. I can't tell you how glad I am to finally meet you." He was tall, about 6'2", with dark hair going silver at the temples in a way that some men achieve naturally and others work at. His teeth were very white. His handshake was the practiced kind, firm enough to communicate confidence without tipping into aggression. I had driven enough powerful men in enough back seats to recognize a performance when I saw one, but I told myself I was being unfair, projecting cynicism onto a nervous man meeting his girlfriend's father for the first time. We had lunch in the backyard. Corporal took immediately and aggressively against him, which I noticed but chose, as I said, to attribute to the dog's general distrust of strangers. Derek was entertaining company. He told stories well. He asked about my time at Meridian with what seemed like genuine interest. Though in retrospect I think he was calibrating, assessing, filing away information the way a careful man files away tools he might need later. There was one moment, just one, that I turned over in my mind later that night after they'd driven back to Columbus. It was a small thing. We were talking about retirement savings, in the abstract way you talk about such things with someone you've just met, and Derek made a comment. He said something like, "Well, at a certain age, you want somebody younger handling the complicated decisions. No offense, Mr. Whitmore. The markets have just gotten so complicated. It takes a certain kind of mind to keep up." He said it pleasantly, with a smile, with a self-deprecating laugh attached to the end of it. I smiled back. I said I understood, but I filed it. Over the following months, Claire and Derek's relationship moved quickly. By January, they were living together. By March, he'd proposed, at a restaurant I'd never heard of that apparently had a months-long waiting list. Claire called me right after, crying the happy kind of tears, and I told her congratulations and meant it, because she sounded so joyful that my own reservations felt like selfishness. The engagement period was busy and bright and full of the logistics of a wedding, which temporarily papered over any cracks that might have been forming underneath. I drove to Columbus twice to help with planning decisions. Derek was present and charming at both visits. He called me Harold. I hadn't told him he could, but I let it go. The wedding was in May, as I said. Beautiful day. Dorothy's sister Vera cried through the entire ceremony, and I sat beside her and held her hand, and I thought about Dorothy every minute of it in the private, undisruptive way you think about people you've lost during moments they should have witnessed. I thought she would have loved the flowers, pale yellow and white, which were her colors. It was at the reception, very briefly, that I saw the second thing I filed away without fully acknowledging why. Claire had spilled a small amount of champagne on her dress. Nothing serious, completely accidental, the kind of thing that happens at every reception. She laughed about it. But Derek's face, in the half-second before he arranged it into a smile, did something I recognized from years of watching powerful men in back seats. It clenched. Jaw tightened, eyes went flat, a micro-expression of irritation so controlled it would have been invisible to most people. Then the smile came, and he made a light-hearted comment and put his arm around her, and the moment was over. I told myself I was reading too much into it. The trouble is, you can only tell yourself that so many times. The first Thanksgiving after the wedding was the clearest early turning point, though I didn't call it that at the time. I drove down to Columbus on the Wednesday before, staying in the guest room of the house they'd bought in Worthington. A very nice house. A house that I would later learn was purchased partly with a financial gift from Claire's inheritance from her mother, a fact that had not been mentioned to me, and that I had only stumbled on when helping Claire organize some paperwork over the summer. Thanksgiving dinner was Claire's production from start to finish. She cooked the entire meal, turkey, 3 sides, 2 pies, and it was extraordinary. The way everything she commits herself to is extraordinary. Derek's contribution was selecting the wine, which he did with the kind of elaborate ceremony that is meant to establish expertise as a substitute for actual effort. We were at the table halfway through the meal when Derek made a toast. He raised his glass and said pleasant things about family, about gratitude, about Claire, and then he turned to me and added, with that smooth, faultless smile, and to Harold, who I'm sure has a lot of wisdom to share with us, even if he maybe repeats himself a little these days. He laughed. His 2 friends from work who were present laughed. Claire's laugh was a half-second late and slightly too high. I looked at her, just a look. She met my eyes for a moment and then looked down at her plate. I raised my glass. I said, "Thank you, Derek." And I smiled the specific kind of smile I had learned from 22 years of driving important men who said condescending things to their assistants while forgetting I could hear every syllable. The smile that doesn't move behind the eyes. The pattern, once you've named it, is impossible to unsee. That's the thing about escalating behavior. It relies on nobody giving it a name. It thrives in the gap between what a reasonable person would call acceptable and what a reasonable person would call abuse. Derek was a master of that gap. At Christmas that year, he made a comment about my driving. "Claire worries about you on the highway, Harold. It's such a long trip. Maybe next year we should just FaceTime." Claire had said nothing of the sort to me directly. I knew it. She knew I knew it. She poured more eggnog. At Easter, he made a joke at dinner about the Veterans Center where I volunteered. Called it Your Little Project in front of Claire's friend Mara and Mara's husband. Harold's got his little project with the veterans, keeps him busy, right, Harold? His tone suggested I was attending a hobby class, not working with men and women who had served their country and come back to discover that the country's bureaucracy had very little patience for them. I said, evenly and pleasantly, "It's good work. I recommend it." He changed the subject. The Easter incident was also when he first started making comments about my finances with slightly less cover than before. Nothing direct, but remarks, observations. "Harold, are you still with that same small-town investment guy? Because I know some people who really do this professionally." Or at a different dinner in the early summer. "Dad, have you thought about maybe simplifying things? At a certain point, the complexity of managing accounts yourself just isn't worth the stress." He'd started calling me Dad by then, which I had also not invited and which I liked even less than Harold. The thing is, I am not a complicated man financially, but I am also not a careless one. Dorothy and I had been careful our whole lives. We had a paid-off house. We had savings. We had investments. Modest ones. Managed through a firm in Millbrook that I had worked with for nearly 2 decades. We had the insurance payout from Dorothy's policy and the inheritance from her parents, which she had designated for Claire and which sat in a separate account, intact, earning modest interest. I knew where every dollar was. I knew every account number. I had a lawyer, a woman named Patricia Osei, sharp and thorough, who I'd been referred to by another veteran at the center and who I'd been working with for 3 years on estate planning. I am telling you this because it matters. Because Derek, in his careful, escalating way, was building a picture of me in my daughter's mind. An old man, a confused old man, an old man who maybe needed help, an old man who wouldn't notice, who couldn't keep track, who might be relieved to have someone else step in. It was a Saturday evening in October, 14 months after the wedding, 2.5 years after I first met Derek in my driveway. When I drove down to Worthington for a visit I had announced a few days in advance. Claire had invited me for dinner. A simple plan, and I had arrived to find her still cooking, while Derek was taking a call in the living room. I had let myself in with the key Claire had given me, set my overnight bag in the guest room, and walked back toward the kitchen. The hallway from the guest room passes the study, and the study shares a wall, a thin wall, it turned out, with the kitchen. I wasn't trying to listen. I want to be absolutely clear about that. I was walking. My shoes on the hardwood made no sound because I have walked quietly my entire adult life. Another habit from the army that I never fully shook. I heard his voice first, lower than his usual register, which meant he was speaking privately, the way you speak when you believe there are no consequences to what you're saying. Claire, listen to me. That account, the one from your mother, it's just sitting there. He doesn't know what he's doing with it. I've told you this. A pause. Claire said something I couldn't make out fully, something that sounded like hesitation, something that included my name. And then Derek said it, clear and full and comfortable with itself. Your father won't even notice if it's gone. He's not tracking any of it anymore. Half the time he can't even remember what day it is. Another pause. Then, I'm not saying we steal it, Claire. I'm saying we help him manage it better. He'll be grateful. He won't understand what we've done long enough to object. I stood in the hallway, my hand flat against the wall. My heartbeat measured and slow, the way it gets when my body is in a situation my mind recognizes as requiring precision. I thought about Sergeant Rourke. I thought about 22 years of being invisible in a front seat while important men said things they would never have said if they'd known anyone capable of consequence was listening. I thought about Dorothy. I thought about the account from Dorothy's parents, the one she had set aside for Claire, which Derek wanted to touch with his careful manicured hands. I stood there for perhaps 45 seconds. Then I walked back to the guest room. Quietly. I sat on the edge of the bed. I took my phone from my pocket. I didn't call the police because nothing criminal had happened yet. Not that I could prove in those 45 seconds. I didn't confront Derek because angry confrontations are what men like Derek are prepared for. They have answers, they have deflections, they have a wounded face they can put on. What I did was open my contacts and scroll to Patricia Osei's number and send her a text message that read, Patricia, I need to speak with you first thing tomorrow morning. It's important and it's time sensitive. Please call me before 9. Then I washed my face. I put my phone in my pocket. I walked into the kitchen and said, Something smells incredible, Claire Bear, using the nickname I'd had for her since she was 4 years old and had announced to the family that she was, in fact, a bear. She turned and smiled at me, and I could see in the particular quality of her smile, slightly too bright, slightly held around the edges, that she was not entirely at peace. Derek emerged from the living room a moment later, phone in hand, and shook my hand warmly and said it was great to see me. I told him it was great to see him too. I meant neither word. Dinner was good. The conversation was ordinary. I went to bed early, citing the drive, and lay in the dark of the guest room listening to the house settle around me, thinking through next steps with the same methodical patience I had used to plan long cross-country routes. Account for everything. Leave room for variables. Know every exit before you need one. Patricia called me at 8:14 the next morning. I had already been awake for almost 3 hours. I stepped outside into the backyard with my coffee and explained what I had heard. Patricia did not gasp. Patricia does not gasp. She listened with the focused silence of someone taking notes, and when I finished, she said, Harold, how detailed are your current records on those accounts? Statements, account numbers, history of transactions. I told her I had everything. Digital files, backed up, and physical copies in a fireproof safe at the house in Millbrook. She said, Good. Here's what I'm going to do. I will tell you what she did. Patricia Osei had been a family law and estate attorney for 26 years. She was 52 years old, small, immaculately dressed, and possessed of a manner that was simultaneously warm and utterly without mercy in a negotiating context. She had seen, over those 26 years, a particular kind of case that she described to me once as financial elder targeting by proximity, meaning the manipulation or exploitation of an older person's assets by someone inside their own family or household circle. She knew exactly what to look for, and she knew exactly how to respond. What she did first was she called Derek. Not Claire, not me, not a judge. Derek. She called Derek Callum's cell phone at 10:47 on the morning after I stood in that hallway, and she identified herself as Harold James Whitmore's attorney, and she informed him, in the calm and precise language of a person who knows exactly which words have legal weight, that she had been made aware of certain conversations concerning Mr. Whitmore's finances, that she would be filing an immediate protective order freezing all accounts connected to Mr. Whitmore pending a full legal review, and that any attempt to access, transfer, influence, or advise on those accounts by any party outside the existing management structure would be treated as financial exploitation under Ohio Revised Code, Section 291302, and prosecuted accordingly. She told me later that there was a very long silence on his end of the line. She told me he said eventually, "I think there's been a misunderstanding." She told him that she hoped so, and that the review process would clarify any misunderstanding thoroughly, and that she looked forward to whatever documentation he might provide to help establish the nature of his intentions. Then she thanked him for his time and ended the call. I was still in the backyard when she called me back with the update. Claire's kitchen window was visible from where I stood. The house was quiet. I looked at the window and thought about my daughter inside it, about what she'd heard, about what she might have said yes to, about how frightened she might already be of a man she had married in good faith, and whose true intentions had only gradually revealed themselves. I had not been angry in the hallway. I had been clear, but standing in that backyard, looking at the window of my daughter's house, something that had been compressed and held in place inside my chest for a long time released itself. Not loudly, quietly, the way something clenched for too long finally lets go. I set my coffee mug down on the patio table. I went back inside. Claire was at the kitchen counter. She turned when she heard me, and her face told me everything before she said a single word. It was the face of someone who has just received information that reorganizes everything they thought they understood about their own life. "Dad," she said, "Derek just got a call from your lawyer." "I know," I said. "He's—" She stopped. She looked at her hands. "He's very upset. I imagine he is. What did she say to him? What is going on?" I pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down and asked Claire to sit down too, and she did, and I told her. Not what Patricia had said to Derek, what I had heard in the hallway the night before. I told her exactly, word for word, because I had spent the entire previous evening memorizing it so that I could do exactly that, deliver it without editorializing, without emotion coloring the delivery, so that she could hear the words for what they were without the additional weight of my reaction layered on top. She listened. Her face went through several things in the space of about 2 minutes. Disbelief first, not of me, but of the reality itself. Then a particular kind of stillness that I recognized because I had seen it before, in a different context, in a younger version of her face. "He said I wouldn't notice," I said finally. "He was wrong about that." Claire looked up at me. Her eyes were wet, but she was not crying. Not yet. "How long?" she said. It wasn't a complete question, but I understood what she was asking. How long have I thought something was wrong with him? Or how long has something been wrong? Either one. "First answer," I said, "since the first Thanksgiving." Second answer, I think longer than either of us can see clearly from where we're standing right now. She got up and walked to the kitchen window and stood there with her back to me and her arms wrapped around herself. I gave her the silence she needed. I'm not a man who fills silences for the sake of filling them. After a while, she turned back and said, "Dad, I want to tell you something. And I need you to just listen." I nodded. What she told me then was not about money. It was about something else entirely. Something I had feared but not named. The kind of behavior that happens behind closed doors, that looks like bad moods and high standards and volatility, that always just barely stops short of anything definitive enough to point to. She told me about the arguments, about the way he spoke to her when no one else was present, about the evening 3 months earlier when she'd arrived home late from a work dinner, a dinner I knew about that she'd told me about in advance, and he had blocked the doorway of their bedroom for 2 full minutes while she stood in front of him asking him to move. About the morning she'd found her phone moved and her call history reviewed, though he'd denied it with such easy certainty that she'd wondered if she was remembering wrong. She told me about the time she'd thought about calling me and had almost dialed and then hadn't, because she'd been afraid of upsetting me, afraid I was too old for this kind of worry, afraid— She stopped. She looked at me. Afraid I was too old, she said. He put that thought in your head, I said. She nodded. Once, very small. I got up from the table and I crossed the kitchen and I put my arms around my daughter, who is 34 years old and has her mother's eyes and my stubbornness, and she held on to me the way she used to hold on to me when she was little, and something had frightened her, and neither of us said anything for a long time. Then I said very quietly, into her hair, "You don't have to be afraid of upsetting me. I have been here the whole time. I am still here." Derek came home 2 hours later. He had clearly composed himself during the drive. His voice was level, his expression calibrated to a combination of injured innocence and reasonable concern. He walked in and looked at both of us, reading the room, recalibrating. "Claire," he said. "Harold, I think we all need to talk about this calmly." "I agree entirely," I said. He looked at me. Something in my tone was apparently not what he had prepared for, because he spent about 2 seconds reassessing before he said, "I want you to understand that I had the best intentions for your finances, Harold. I've been worried about you. We both have." "I know what you said," I told him. "I was in the hallway." He went very still. "I heard every word," I said. "Every word, Derek. The part about the account. The part about my not tracking things. The part about me not noticing long enough to object." His jaw moved. He looked at Claire. She met his eyes and did not look away, which I noted with quiet pride. He looked back at me. "That was taken completely out of context," he said. "The context," I said, "is that Patricia Osei has already frozen the relevant accounts, filed the initial protective documentation, and will be in contact with you through your own legal representation, which you should arrange today. The context is that my finances are not, and have never been, available for your management. The context is that whatever you hoped would happen will not happen. That's the full context." He stood in the doorway of his own kitchen for a long moment, and I watched him arrive at the recognition that the old man he had been certain was confused and manageable, had, in fact, been several moves ahead of him since the previous night, and that there were no moves remaining to him here that weren't going to make things worse. He chose anger. Men like Derek often do when their calm performance runs out of runway. He said something sharp and cutting. I won't repeat it, because it doesn't deserve the space. And he pointed at Claire as if she were a possession that had malfunctioned. That was when Claire said, in a voice that was entirely level and entirely final, "I want you to leave the house, Derek. Tonight. I'll have my attorney contact yours." He left. Not immediately. There was another 20 minutes of Derek performing wounded dignity and righteous grievance. But he left. And when the front door closed behind him, the house settled into a silence that felt entirely different from the silence of before. Cleaner. Like a window opened for the first time in a long time. A police welfare check had been requested by Patricia as a precautionary measure. She had suggested it, given what Claire had described about the blocked doorway. And 2 officers arrived about 90 minutes after Derek departed. They were professional and kind. The younger of the 2, a woman named Officer Reyes, asked Claire careful questions and listened with the particular attentiveness of someone who has been trained to hear what is behind the words, not just the words themselves. At one point, Officer Reyes glanced at me and said, "Mr. Whitmore, were you aware of the previous incidents your daughter mentioned?" "Some of them," I said. "Not all." She looked at me for a moment with the expression I have learned to recognize as the one people produce when they're recalibrating their initial assessment of someone. "You handled this very carefully," she said. "A lot of people would have come in swinging." "A lot of people would have tipped him off," I said, "and then we'd be having a different conversation." She nodded slowly. "What did you do before retirement, if you don't mind me asking?" I told her. "Meridian Transportation, 22 years. Army before that." She looked at me again. Then she said quietly, almost to herself, "Yeah, that tracks." The formal complaint was filed. The protective orders were extended. Patricia recommended a family law attorney for Claire. a man named Garrison who had handled domestic control cases for 15 years and had, Patricia told me, a particular and useful gift for making men like Derek understand, through legal process, that they had substantially overestimated their position. The weeks that followed were not easy. I want to be honest about that because I think the stories we tell each other sometimes make recovery sound cleaner than it is. Claire had married this man. She had built a life with him. Or tried to. Unwinding that life is not a single moment of liberation. It's 100 small, unwinding moments, and some of them hurt in unexpected ways. She stayed in the Worthington house initially, because Garrison advised it, and because she was determined not to be displaced from her own home by someone else's bad behavior. Derek moved in with a colleague. There were several formal communications through attorneys. There was one moment, I heard about it secondhand from Garrison, where Derek's lawyer suggested that the entire situation had been a misunderstanding exacerbated by an elderly relative's interference, which was apparently the legal term Derek's attorney had chosen for what I had done. Patricia Osei had a documented response to that characterization that I was told was thorough, precise, and entirely unsuited for repeating in polite company. The evidence gathering was meticulous. Claire had more than I'd expected, because even when you're in the middle of something frightening, some part of you is quietly building the record that will matter later. She had dates, she had texts, she had a voicemail she'd saved without quite knowing why, from 8 months prior, in which Derek's tone was so different from his public voice that even listened to alone in the attorney's conference room, it was enough to make Garrison's assistant set down her pen and very quietly clear her throat. I testified in the deposition. I sat across a table from Derek's attorney and I told him, in careful sequence, everything I had heard in the hallway, everything I had observed over 14 months, and everything Claire had told me on the morning after. Derek's attorney was a competent man who tried several different approaches to establish that I was confused, misremembering, or allowing emotion to distort my account of events. I am 68 years old. I drove powerful men through 3 states for 22 years. I learned to recall conversations verbatim because the men in my back seats sometimes gave instructions they later wanted to claim they had never given. And I learned early that an accurate memory, maintained and exercised, is one of the most valuable things a person can carry. Derek's attorney eventually moved on. There was a formal hearing. The room was not glamorous, a county court facility with fluorescent lighting and chairs that were clearly designed to be functional rather than comfortable. Derek sat on the far side of the room. He was dressed impeccably, which was consistent. He looked at me once, across the space between the tables, and his expression was a controlled thing. Arranged, buttoned up, giving nothing away. I met it and held it without arrangement. At one point, the proceeding required a statement about the purpose of the complaint, specifically whether this was being pursued as financial exploitation or as a civil grievance. Garrison stood and made the case clearly. Protective order violations, documented evidence of emotional coercion, the recorded conversations concerning Mr. Whitmore's accounts, and the pattern of behavior across the prior 14 months. The judge was a woman named Judge Althea Marsh, who was perhaps 60 herself, and who listened to the proceedings with an expression of absolute composed attention. When she spoke precisely. She asked Derek's attorney a question about the timeline of the account access discussions, and Derek's attorney's response contained an inconsistency, a small one, but she caught it and noted it with one additional question, and the answer to that question documented the inconsistency in the formal record. Garrison leaned over and wrote one word on his legal pad and slid it toward me. It said, "Good." The outcome of the hearing was a restraining order, protective order technically, prohibiting Derek from any contact with Claire's financial documentation, any contact with my accounts or the accounts connected to Dorothy's estate, and requiring mediated negotiation for the divorce proceedings through the court's recommended process. The divorce itself, once formally initiated, moved with the speed that divorces without children and with clear documentation tend to move. Derek was also required to submit to a formal financial audit of the accounts he managed professionally, a provision his attorney objected to strenuously, and which Judge Marsh overruled with a tone that suggested she had very little patience for the objection. I don't know everything that happened on that side of the audit. What I know is that it involved a conversation between Derek's firm and its compliance division that resulted in Derek's departure from that firm by mid-January, a departure that was, according to the brief public statement the firm released, mutually agreed upon. I have learned in my life that mutually agreed upon in that context means something specific, and it does not mean what the phrase sounds like. Derek signed the divorce papers in late February. He did it in a room where I was not present, because there was no reason for me to be there and because, frankly, I had already done what needed to be done. The outcome did not require my presence in the room where it was formalized. That's the thing about doing something right. You don't need to watch it end. Claire called me when it was done. I was at the Veterans Center, helping a young man named Marcus with a housing appeal that had been bounced 3 times already on technical grounds. I stepped into the hallway and answered. "It's done, Dad," she said. "I know," I said. "How are you feeling?" She thought about it for a moment. That's one of the things I have always loved about her. She doesn't give you the automatic answer. She thinks first. "Lighter," she said. "Mostly lighter. A little sad, but mostly lighter." "That sounds right," I said. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, Claire Bear." I went back in and helped Marcus with his appeal. We got it filed by 4 o'clock. He shook my hand on the way out and said, "Mr. Whitmore, I don't know what I'd do without you." I told him he'd figure it out because that's true of most people when they have to, but that I was glad he didn't have to do it alone. Spring came the way it does in Ohio. Reluctantly, in stages, the cold stepping back 1 degree at a time as though reconsidering. Claire began what she called the unscrambling of my actual life, which involved a new apartment she had found in the Short North neighborhood, a small place, 2nd floor, with a balcony facing east that she sent me a photo of on a Tuesday morning with a message that just said sunrise. She had a cat now, a gray tabby named Phyllis, who appeared in several subsequent photos in a condition of pure territorial satisfaction. She went back to the design firm, where she had taken 2 weeks of leave during the worst of the legal proceedings and discovered, or perhaps rediscovered, that she was genuinely good at what she did and that her colleagues had missed her in a way that was specific and real, not merely polite. Her supervisor, a woman named Joan, had apparently told her plainly, "I don't know what you were dealing with at home, and you don't have to tell me, but I want you to know this office is better when you're in it." Claire told me about that on the phone with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has been reminded, at exactly the right moment, that their value is not determined by a single person's opinion of them. My own life changed in ways I had not anticipated and had not planned for, which is the best way for change to arrive if it has to arrive at all. The Veterans Center asked me, in April, if I would consider taking on a more formal advisory role, specifically coordinating the Appeals Assistance Program, which had expanded significantly and needed someone who could train volunteers and standardize the process. I said yes. It gave me a reason to be there every day, which it turned out I needed more than I'd realized. My neighbor, Frank Delacroix, a retired high school football coach who had lived 2 houses down for as long as I could remember, and who I had spoken to in a friendly but not close way for most of that time, knocked on my door one Saturday morning in May and asked if I wanted to join the walking group that departed from the community center at 7. I said yes, mostly to be polite, and discovered, to my genuine surprise, that I looked forward to it every week. Frank was good company. He had opinions about things, concrete, committed opinions that he was nonetheless willing to debate. And he had known Dorothy from the neighborhood, and he talked about her sometimes in the natural, unguarded way that people who weren't trying to be careful about it would, which I found I preferred enormously to the careful tiptoeing people often do around grief. One morning in June, about 3 months after the divorce was finalized, Frank looked at me during our walk and said, "You seem lighter lately, Harold." I thought about Claire saying the same word. Lighter. "I think I probably am," I said. "Good," he said, simply. And we kept walking. My grandchildren, Claire's brother Michael's kids, who I sometimes forget to mention because Michael and his family live in Portland and are present in my life via phone calls and visits rather than daily proximity, came to stay with me in Millbrook for 2 weeks in July. Ellie, who was 9, and Tomas, who was 6, occupied the house with the specific high-energy chaos of children who have been in a car for many hours and are making up for lost time. Corporal, who had grown somewhat creaky in his joints, nevertheless roused himself to a state of enthusiasm I hadn't seen from him in months. On the 3rd day of the visit, Ellie found me in the backyard in the early evening, sitting in the chair I keep next to the garden, the one where I drink my 2nd cup of coffee when the day is cooperating. She came and sat in the small folding chair beside it without being asked, which is a habit she has that I find quietly endearing. She sat with her knees pulled up and looked at the garden for a while. And then she said, in the direct manner that 9-year-olds deploy without any awareness of how specifically they are targeting you, "Grandpa, did something bad happen? Mommy said you helped Aunt Claire when something bad happened." I looked at her. She was watching me with those eyes that children have. The ones that aren't naive, exactly, just undefended, open. "Something complicated happened," I said. "To Aunt Claire. And I helped her sort it out." "Was it about the man she was married to?" "It was." She thought about this with visible seriousness. "Was he mean to her?" "He wasn't kind to her," I said. "In some ways that are hard to explain, and in some ways that aren't hard at all." Ellie nodded slowly, the way children do when they're processing something bigger than the vocabulary they have for it. "But she's okay now?" "She's better than okay," I said. "She's herself again." "Good," Ellie said. And then, after a pause, "Why didn't she just leave before?" It is the question, isn't it? It's the question that sounds simple, and contains inside it the entire complexity of why these situations persist as long as they do. "When someone tells you who you are for long enough," I said slowly, "it starts to get harder to remember who you actually are. It's like, you know how if you put a plant in a room with no windows, it starts to grow sideways toward the light from under the door instead of straight up? It's trying its best and it's still growing, but it's growing according to what it has, not according to what it needs." Ellie looked at me. Then she looked at the garden. "So Aunt Claire was growing sideways." "For a while," I said. "Until she got back to the light. You helped her get back to the light." "We helped each other," I said, which is the true answer. Because standing in that hallway had not only been for Claire, something in me that had been dormant, some capacity for decisive action that had gone quiet in the years of grief and routine, had been reawakened by what I heard. I had needed the reason to move as much as she had needed me to move. Ellie seemed satisfied with this. She unfolded herself from the chair and said she was going inside for a popsicle, and did I want one? I said yes. She brought me a red one, which is the best kind. In November, about 8 months after the divorce was finalized, an envelope arrived at Patricia's office addressed to me, forwarded from a return address in Dayton, Derek's sister's address, Patricia noted. The handwriting on the envelope was Derek's. Patricia called me before forwarding it, to let me know it was coming, and to advise me that reading it was entirely my choice, and that it had no legal standing or consequence either way. I told her I wanted to read it. It was 2 pages, handwritten, not printed. Handwritten, which I will admit surprised me. It was not a polished letter. It had crossings out and rewritten phrases. His handwriting, which I had never seen before, was small and slanted and slightly erratic in a way that the rest of his presentation never was, which told me something. He wrote that he had spent several months in something he called a process, a word I interpreted as therapy, though he never used the word. He wrote that he understood, now, the difference between the life he had performed and the person he actually was, and that the distance between those two things had produced something that he recognized as dangerous. He wrote that he had not intended to harm Claire, which I believe he believed, and which I also believe is true in the specific and useless way that people mean when they say they didn't intend the consequences of their own deliberate choices. He wrote that he was sorry. He also wrote, in one line near the bottom of the second page, "Mr. Whitmore, I told myself you were someone who didn't know what was happening. I think I told myself that because the alternative, that you knew exactly what was happening and were waiting, was something I couldn't afford to believe." I sat with that for a while. Claire asked me about it that evening when I called her, because I had told her the letter was coming. I read her the parts that were for her to hear. Then I told her about that last line. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Write back?" "I don't know," I said. And then, "What do you want?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't think I want to forgive him. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. But I'm glad he's trying to understand what he did. I think that matters, even if it doesn't change what happened. That's a wise thing, I said. I had a good teacher, she said. Your mother, I said immediately. She laughed, a real one, the kind I hadn't heard enough of in the past 2 years. Yes, she said. Her. And also you stubborn old man. I did not write back to Derek's letter. I folded it and put it in the fireproof safe with the financial records, which was not a sentimental choice, but a practical one. In the unlikely event that anything further needed documenting, it would be there. But I also did not throw it away, because throwing it away felt like a statement I wasn't sure I wanted to make. Forgiveness is not something I have ever experienced as a single decision. It is something that happens slowly, over time, in the accumulated weight of ordinary days in which you find yourself less consumed by the wrong than you were the day before. Whether I will arrive there fully, I genuinely don't know. What I know is this: holding on to the anger would have kept something alive that deserves to die quietly. And so I have been, day by day, letting it die. Claire drove up to Millbrook for Christmas that year, the first Christmas in several years that felt genuinely like itself, rather than a performance of itself. She brought Phyllis the cat, who immediately established a cautious but ultimately functional detente with Corporal that I photographed and sent to Michael in Portland. She brought wine and a casserole, and the particular ease of a person who is back in a place where they don't have to manage anyone else's reactions. We had dinner at the kitchen table, just the two of us, with Corporal at my feet, and Phyllis perched on the counter in a location I had given up enforcing rules about. We talked about her new apartment and the design project she was most excited about, and the friend from the firm who had become something more than a friend, carefully, with the appropriate caution of someone who has learned something from experience. We talked about the Veterans Center, and about Frank and the walking group, and about the time Ellie had told her entire 4th grade class, apparently, that her grandfather had once taken down a bad man, which was a distillation of events that I found both flattering and slightly alarming. We talked about Dorothy, which we did at every Christmas and always would. After dinner, Claire washed and I dried, the way we had always done it, and at some point she turned to me and said, "Dad, do you ever think about how different things could have been if you hadn't been in that hallway?" I thought about it. "I think about it," I said. "And then I think about all the ways I wasn't in enough hallways. All the things I should have noticed sooner, should have named sooner. You noticed. Not fast enough. Dad." She took the dish from my hand and set it down and looked at me squarely. "You showed up. At exactly the right moment, in the right way, you showed up. That's what matters." I looked at my daughter, 34 years old, with Dorothy's eyes and my stubbornness, and her own particular brand of grace that belongs to neither of us, and is entirely hers. "Your mother would have been proud of you," I said. "I know," she said. "She'd have been proud of both of us. I am not a man who cries easily. This is not a virtue. It's just a fact, the product of an upbringing and a profession and a particular temperament that tends toward stillness when it might more productively tend toward expression. But standing in that kitchen on Christmas evening, drying dishes with my daughter, I let myself feel the full weight of it. The fear that had lived in me since that hallway, the relief that was still settling in, the grief that is always present, and that has not diminished but has become something I carry differently. I let myself feel it, and then I put it where it belonged, which is in the past, where it can inform you without directing you. There are things this year has taught me that I am still in the process of learning, which is perhaps the most honest way I can put it. The first is that being quiet is not the same as being absent. I spent a long time after Dorothy died going through the motions of presence, physically there, emotionally somewhere else, in the way that grief makes geography of you. I was in the rooms I was supposed to be in. I wasn't always fully in them. What happened with Claire and Derek forced me back into the room entirely. And the difference between those two states of presence is not something I can fully describe, except to say that one of them is living, and one of them is waiting to be done with living, and I know which one I want to choose. The second is about what strength actually is, which I thought I understood from 22 years driving and 11 years serving, and which I understand more completely now. Strength is not the absence of fear. Strength is not the willingness to confront someone. Strength, in its most real form, is being the person who answers the phone at 2 a.m. because someone is afraid, and then staying calm enough to be useful, and then being patient enough to wait for the right moment, and then being precise enough to act at that moment without overreaching, and then being honest enough to admit, afterward, what you should have done sooner and differently. Strength is answering the phone. That's it. That's the whole thing. The third thing, and this is the one I keep returning to, because I'm not sure I've finished learning it, is that the people who underestimate you are not seeing something that isn't there. They're seeing something that is there, and choosing the interpretation that serves them best. Derek looked at me and saw an old man in decline. That interpretation was useful to him. What he could not account for, what he had no framework for, was the possibility that still water runs deep, that a man who moves quietly through the world does so by choice, and that choice, when it becomes necessary, can be revised. He told Claire her father wouldn't notice. He was wrong. I noticed everything. I always had. I want to speak directly to you for a moment, if I can, not as a narrator. Just as Harold Whitmore, 68 years old, sitting in his kitchen in Millbrook with a cup of coffee and a dog who has finally, after 4 years, accepted that Dorothy is gone and begun sleeping again on the foot of the bed instead of her side. If you have a parent or a grandparent or an elderly neighbor who seems quieter than they used to be, who has retreated into routine and habit and a particular kind of stillness that you might have interpreted as fading, I want you to consider the possibility that they are not fading, that the stillness has substance to it, that the quiet has been earned, and if you are someone who has a Derek in your life, someone who has been slowly, carefully teaching you to doubt your own perceptions, your own memory, your own worth, I want you to know something that took me a long time to fully articulate. The very things they try to convince you are weaknesses are usually the things they are most afraid of. Derek told Claire I was confused because I was not confused. He told her I wouldn't notice because he feared exactly the possibility that I would. They work hardest to dismantle the things that are most intact. And if you are someone who has been sitting in a hallway metaphorically, hearing something you weren't supposed to hear, knowing something you've been trying not to fully acknowledge, I want to tell you that the knowledge is not the burden. The knowledge is the resource. The question is only what you choose to do with it, and when and how. This story has been mine to tell, because it happened to me and to Claire, and because I believe, deeply and without reservation, that the stories we keep private about our families, the difficult ones, the complicated ones, the ones that involve fear and shame and the hard work of recovery, are exactly the stories that deserve to be heard most. Not because they're dramatic, because they're true. Because someone watching this right now is in the middle of their own version, and they need to know that the middle is not the end, and that the people who look calmest are sometimes the ones who have been most carefully paying attention. I would ask you, if this story has moved you in any way, if something in it has touched something real in your own life, or reminded you of someone you love, or given you a thought you want to hold on to, please leave a comment below and tell me. Tell me whatever the story brought up for you. I read every single one, and I want you to know that. If you're watching on this channel and you haven't subscribed yet, please do. Every subscriber tells me that these stories are worth telling, and there are more of them. All of them true. All of them earned. Leave a like if you stayed until the end. It matters more than you know. There is one line I keep coming back to, the one I've been circling around since the moment I stood in that hallway with my hand flat against the plaster, and my heartbeat slow, and my mind running clear and cold and focused. Derek told my daughter, "Your father won't even notice if it's gone." What he did not know, and what I have spent 68 years living, is that the things worth keeping are never unguarded. They only look that way. And the men who tend to believe that stillness equals absence, that quiet equals confusion, that patience equals weakness, those men are always, eventually, surprised. I noticed. I have always noticed. And my daughter is home.